So we're exploring the Rambam, and through exploring the Rambam, we're exploring the first of the Ten Commandments, and it's very quickly emerged that there is no mitzvah to believe in God. And the logic is that if you don't believe in God, how can there be the principle of a mitzvah? Because you have to believe that somebody or some entity instructs that mitzvah. So therefore, obviously, belief in Hashem predates or is the foundation for the principle of doing a mitzvah. So what is the mitzvah then? We saw that the Rambam says the foundation of all foundations and the column or the pillar of all wisdom is to know that there's an original entity. And then, as we mentioned, he goes into 5 paragraphs describing details around Hashem as this original entity. And then he concludes to say, and knowing this information is a positive mitzvah. We're going to see that the Rambam does a similar thing just a little bit later. Very similar thing. But before we do that, I just want to draw your attention to something interesting. Anytime that you have a great scholar in the medieval space, they can't just make a statement without a basis for that statement. As of course we shouldn't, right? We shouldn't claim any view within Torah unless we have a basis for that view. So what we do always when we're learning is we try and work out, how did this individual reach that conclusion? What's their source? It's a lot of what the Gemara does as well. So how do you know that this is the particular halacha? What's the source? And then we'll go back and look at a verse in the Torah or something like that to find the basis. The Rambam, and this is really interesting because people always position the Rambam as a rationalist. Now, while the Rambam's approach to many subjects is a very rational approach, it's not a fair or accurate comment to suggest that the Rambam is purely a rationalist. The Rambam also dips into spiritual principles and mystical principles, including in his book of Jewish law. And he has a great example, because if you look at the words that the Rambam uses introducing this topic about knowing God, because now we're saying it's not believing God, it's knowing God, you will see that he is saying in Hebrew almost exactly what the Zohar, which of course is a mystical text, says in Aramaic. Because here he says that the foundation of all foundations is to know God, and the Zohar says that the original instruction is to know God. And as you map it out, the words of the Zohar and the words of the Rambam seem to be almost identical, just presented in different language. So that implies that the basis for the Rambam's proposition that the mitzvah is to know God rather than to believe in God is something that is very closely associated with what the Zohar teaches us, which is, again, the same principle, that the mitzvah is to know Hashem rather than just simply to believe in Hashem. Now, the difference between the mechanism that you use in order to have belief and the mechanism that you use in order to know something is not altogether different. What I mean is, of course we'll have a core belief in order to get the ball rolling. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. Because if you don't have belief in Hashem, there is no starting point for your entire spiritual or Jewish journey. So there's got to be an element of belief that sits right at the core of the whole process. But we also know that a person can deepen their experience of belief. And one of the ways that you deepen your experience of belief, which is what the Rambam is calling the mitzvah over here, is to know more about the subject, to know more about Hashem. If a person has a very superficial understanding of Hashem, then you have to expect that they're going to have a rather superficial belief in Hashem. Whereas, if a person has a much more developed appreciation of Hashem, then they're going to have a deeper belief in Hashem. It just makes sense. So in fact, the mitzvah is leda, to know, which means to learn. We have to learn information about God. And this is really, really important, because it's possible for a person to go through their entire Jewish journey knowing a lot of information and a lot of detail about what Jews are supposed to do. So we might know a lot of detail about the laws and the traditions and the customs that we have without necessarily knowing a lot about God. And it's a fascinating possibility, and in a sense almost like a little bit of a scary possibility, that you could have people who are religious for decades, very, very well versed in all the details of Jewish law. They can quote this Gemara and they know that what the halacha is in that very obscure situation, and they haven't necessarily invested time in learning to know God. And the Rambam is telling us over here in the opening of his 14 volumes of Jewish law that the ultimate foundation of everything is to know God. So in other words, what he's telling us is we actually have to learn information about Hashem. We have to find those parts of the Torah that get into that detail, that explore those subjects. And those are not necessarily the books that people are learning as a matter of course. As a matter of course, people are learning the history and the laws. So it's really, really valuable to understand what's going on over here. Here the Rambam is telling us that you have to know about God. Now that's going to lead us to something else really, really interesting about what the Rambam does. In these early laws, this Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundations of Torah, he tells us that the mitzvah is to know God. The next mitzvah is to appreciate that God is one, as opposed to the greatest. Big difference, right? The greatest implies there might be other deities or other powers that exist in the universe. We have to know that God is one. And then he says, and the other mitzvahs are to love God and to be in reverence of God, in awe of God. And then he says this: in order for a person to have love of Hashem, and in order for a person to revere Hashem, you also have to have information. Now this goes back to a similar question. Remember yesterday we said that the Barbanel asked the question, how can you instruct somebody what to believe? Doesn't make any sense. There's a similar question. How can you instruct a person what to feel? You can't tell somebody, today you have to feel happy. What do you mean? What if I don't feel happy today? What if I woke up on the wrong side of bed? What if it's the weather was miserable or something like that? Whatever. I don't. What if I don't feel so good in the morning? Today I'm not so happy. You can't tell me how to feel. It's like in the old days, when the shidduch system was essentially the family said, you're going to marry so-and-so, and they met for 5 minutes. The father would meet the groom, and the bride would walk in and put down a thing of tea, and that's when he saw his future wife for the first time, and that's it. Then they got married. You can tell somebody who to marry. You can't tell somebody to love the person they married. You can't tell somebody how to love. So how is there an instruction in the Torah that you should love Hashem your God? Can't tell me how to feel. Can't tell me what emotion I should have. So the Rambam says that the way to achieve love and reverence of Hashem is you have to contemplate certain ideas, certain subjects about Hashem's greatness. And when you think about these things, your natural reaction will be either to feel this tremendous love and pull towards Hashem, or this overwhelming reverence of Hashem. So in order to love Hashem, the Rambam tells us that what we have to do is we have to contemplate certain facts, certain ideas. And once he tells us that, he goes into 3 chapters worth of philosophy. Now again, we've already established that this particular book is supposed to be a book of halacha. It's supposed to be a book of Jewish law. And Jewish law is about getting to the bottom line. What are you supposed to do? What are you not supposed to do? And yet here the Rambam goes into 3 chapters of philosophy. And he divides those 3 chapters into 2 subjects. The one subject he calls Maaseh Merkava, which directly translated means the details of the divine chariot, otherwise known as the divine throne. And the other section is what he calls Maaseh Bereshis, the details of creation. And he goes into a lot of detail, explaining and describing angels and what the different kinds of angels are, and what the difference is between the experience of being an angel versus the experience of being a human, that angels don't really have a body in the classical sense, but they have some kind of form, and expressing the nature of how these angels relate to Hashem. And then he tells us about the process of creation. And what's interesting also, just parenthetically, and become a little bit relevant later, is that he tells us the first topic, Maaseh Merkava, which is all these spiritual secrets, you don't teach in public, and which is ironic because here the Rambam is teaching it in public. So that's going to be relevant a little bit later in our conversation. But the fact is, he says that these are really profound topics, and they are very abstract and they're very subtle. And so you have to be very discerning about who you share this information with, because if a person is not of the caliber that they can actually appreciate it, they're going to corrupt it. And then even after he goes into the details of the process of creation, he again says, even this information you don't share wholesale. People have to first fill themselves with more basic information of Torah, and then they can get into this type of conversation. And he even uses the expression, he says, it is inappropriate for a person to hike or to, like we would say in Yiddish, to spazier, to take a stroll in the paradise. Paradise is a play on words because paradise means an orchard, but it's also used often to refer to a very developed spiritual state. So he says you shouldn't go strolling in the paradise. In other words, you shouldn't go spending your time exploring these mystical concepts until you have, in his words, filled yourself with meat and potatoes, which basically means, staple foods. First, you've got to know what Judaism is and how you're supposed to behave as a Jewish person and so on and so forth. And then you can get into these details. So it's quite ironic that the Rambam seems to be doing exactly the opposite of what he advises. He tells us that we have to first fill ourselves with the basics of Judaism, then we can get into the mysticism, and yet he begins his whole book of the basics of Judaism by teaching us mystical principles. So that's really strange. But what's relevant to our conversation is that when the Rambam wraps up this whole section, where he speaks about the knowledge of the spiritual and the like all the different realms and it's really complex and abstract stuff. And after he speaks about the process of creation, then he says, and all of what we have discussed in these 5 chapters, so remember, 3 of the chapters are dedicated to these topics. When he says 5 chapters, he means from the beginning of the book, he links it back to the mitzvah of knowing God. In other words, what he's illustrating to us is that in order for a person to fulfill the requirement of the Torah, I am Hashem your God, the first of the 10 commandments, in order to fulfill that, which, as we've now established, is not simply to recognize that I believe in God, but much more than that is to know God. So if you want to go down the path of knowing God, the way to get there is you have to actually explore deep mystical concepts. That's basically what he's telling us. And these deep mystical concepts are effectively 2 major subjects that you have to explore. You have to understand a little bit about how the world works, because when you observe the world, and when you observe the complexity of the world, and when you observe the fine-tuned balance of how everything interacts in the world, the different ecosystems, our planet, how it's exactly positioned to be in the right range, that it gets enough heat from the sun and not too much heat from the sun, and the fact that the seasons work exactly as they're supposed to work, and the fact that the world is designed to regenerate itself, so plants, animals, humans all regenerate themselves, and all of that kind of detail, that will get you to have an appreciation of Hashem. That will get you to know Hashem. Because exactly the point, the challenge that we have around knowing Hashem is you can't know something which is completely invisible. You can't know something which is completely abstract. Now we know in our lives that the way that humans are designed, we know this from our own experience, is that the more intimately you know something, the more likely it is that you could have some kind of feeling about it. So if somebody had to approach you today and say, I'd like to know, are you not upset about what's happening right now in the new budget in Somalia? They'll say, I'm not upset about it. Why? Because I don't know anything about it. Like the cliche, what's the difference between ignorance and apathy? I don't know and I don't care. But really what the meaning is, if I don't know, then I cannot care. If I don't know about something, how could I possibly have any level of emotional attachment to it? So the principle says that if I don't know something, then it's meaningless in my life. Even if I claim that I believe in it. So let's use a different example. Let's say that you've got a particular location that you want to go visit because all of your friends have been there, and everybody who comes back tells you how amazing it is and how it's life-changing and so on and so forth. Okay, you believe it to be true, but you don't have a strong emotion associated with that particular place or that particular event because you don't really know anything about it. Then you go to that place, you experience that event. Now you're a changed person. Now you become the advocate. Now you're telling everybody else, you don't understand. Before I went, I had no appreciation of what that is. But now that I've been, everybody's got to go. That's how it is, right? So until something becomes real to us, until we have some meaningful appreciation of it, we can't have any emotional attachment to it. So the mitzvah is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. That means that we have to invest the effort and the learning to start to know Hashem, to start to know things about Hashem, which in turn will help us to know Hashem. And as a result of that, we'll be able to have love and reverence of Hashem. So that's why it puts it all into one section. These 5 chapters, it's all one section because it's all one continuum. The same mechanism that you use in order to get to know Hashem is the same mechanism that you're going to use in order to have a meaningful relationship with Hashem. So if a person will be superficial in their understanding and appreciation of Hashem, then they have to expect that they're not going to have a mature relationship with Hashem. But if a person is going to invest and they're going to learn, and not just learn, headlines, but you're actually going to delve into this information and get some really meaningful insight into Hashem and how He manages creation, etc., then as a result, a person's going to have a very deep, meaningful relationship with Hashem. So that's really the positioning statement of the Rambam, and that's really what the first commandment in the Torah is. I am Hashem your God. That's the commandment. I want to throw something in over here, which is from a fundamental principle in Chassidus, which is really, really fascinating and relevant to this conversation. There's an expression that goes like this, and by way of introduction, before we get into the conversation about Hashem, let's just understand how it works with human beings. One of the most annoying things that a human being can ever say to you is, I know what you're going through. And the reason it's so annoying is because even if the other person has had what they believe to be an identical experience to what we've had, they do not have the identical experience in the identical way. Which means you could have two individuals who go through objectively the exact same things. So this person has this particular health challenge, that person has the same health challenge. This person lost their business, that person lost their business. That person had to emigrate at a young age, this person had to emigrate, whatever, right? So ostensibly the experiences look identical. So how is it that a person can say, I'm offended or I'm annoyed at the fact that you say, I know how you feel? Because at the end of the day, you are you and I am I. And the circumstances of my life and the wiring of my brain and the hierarchy of my emotions is different to yours. So you could put us through the identical experience, but we won't have the identical experience because we're different people. So the only way that you could know what I'm going through would be what? If you were me. It's the only way you could know what I'm going through. If you were me, you'd know what I'm going through. That's why the Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us, don't judge another person until you've been in their place. The implied message over there is you can never judge another person because you can never be in their place. You can be in their circumstances, but you can never be in their place. So, if that's true of human beings, that you can't really know somebody intimately, the only way you would know them intimately would have to be them, so then that definitely has to be true of Hashem, right? If I can't know you, I can only know things about you, then surely I can't know Hashem. And so the expression that we use is, Ilu yeda'ativ, if I would know him, hayisiv, I would be him. So the implied message over there is you can never really know Hashem. Because you'd have to be Hashem to know Hashem. If I have to be you in order to really know what you're going through, 1,000,000 times more, I'd have to be Hashem in order to know Hashem. So the implied message over there is you can never know Hashem. And what the Rambam is proposing over here, right at the beginning of his series of laws, is you've got to learn, you've got to contemplate, but you're never going to know. It's not possible. Now, Chassidus has a very revolutionary perspective on this. Very revolutionary. As you well know, one of the things that Judaism does not do is punctuate sentences. Right? In any classical Jewish text, there's no punctuation. Starting with the Torah itself, it's just a sea of words. And the same is true of the Gemara, etc., etc. There's no punctuation. So, as a result, Jews sometimes can be a little bit liberal with the way that we punctuate sentences. And that includes the inflection. So you know the story of the guy, there's an old man Goldberg who gets arrested. And the reason he's arrested is because he walks in to the golf club that says, it's only for certain people. He walks in. So the judge says to him, he says, Goldberg, how do you plead? He says, not guilty, Your Honor. So the judge says to him, did you see the massive sign at the entrance to this golf course? He says, yes, Your Honor, I saw the sign. And did you not see that the sign says that you can't just walk into the golf course, you have to be a member? He says, Your Honor, it's not what the sign said. So the judge says, look, I saw the sign. We have it here. He has a picture, Exhibit A. And the sign says very clearly, private property, no trespassers allowed. Goldberg, how can you say that that sign does not mean that you can't just wander onto the golf course? He says, Your Honor, I think you've read the sign wrong. This is how the sign reads. Private property? No! Trespassers allowed. So we repunctuate, right? So in the same context, the expression goes, the expression goes, Ilu yedaitiv. If I would know Hashem, hayusiv, I would be Hashem, implying you can't know Hashem because you can't be Hashem. Comes along Chassidus and says, Ilu yedaitiv hayusiv. How can I know Hashem? Because I am part of Hashem, because I have a neshama. And my neshama is what we call, as the pasuk calls it, chelek elokah mimal. It is a piece from Hashem from on high. The Alter Rebbe in his book of Tanya includes at the end of that the word mamash. We're literally a piece of Hashem. Therefore, it is possible that if we apply ourselves and we actually learn this information, we can know Hashem. Doesn't mean we can know Hashem fully. Obviously not. Hashem is infinite and we are finite. But we can know elements, we can know things about Hashem that ostensibly people would say you should not be able to know. So that's what the Rambam is telling us over here. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the first instruction in the Torah, the first commandment, I should say, of the 10 commandments, is that I am Hashem your God. You have to know Hashem. In order to know Hashem, here is a map of how you do it. That's why he dedicates the first 5 paragraphs to tell us what you're supposed to know about Hashem, and after that 3 chapters to explaining things that Hashem does in the world, all of which is designed to help us understand the principles that we should be learning in order to be able to make Hashem real to us. Now, one of the things that's magnificent about Torah works is that they always link the beginning and the end of the book. So whatever is stated at the beginning, you see this often in the Gemara, is rounded off at the end. It's what we call no'utz, tchilasan, b'sofan, b'sofan, b'tchilasan, that the way Hashem has designed everything is that the end and the beginning are all linked to each other. At the end of his book, the Rambam writes about the time of Moshiach, and he says that in the time of Moshiach, then lo yeh eisa kol olam koloi, elo ladas es Hashem belvad. That in the time of Moshiach, the occupation of the entire world will be nothing else except to know Hashem. See that? So at the beginning of his book, he tells us that the first imperative of Judaism is you have to get to know Hashem. And at the end of the book, he tells us there will come a time, in the time of Mashiach, because right now, as much as we're going to try, and as much as we're going to learn, there'll be limits on how much we can actually understand about Hashem. But in the time of Mashiach, those limits will be removed, and we'll be able to know Hashem. And then he says 2 things. Therefore, at that time, the Jewish people will be very wise, and they will know da'as boiram, they will know the knowledge of their Creator, and that's the one thing he says. And the second thing that he says is they will know devarim astumim, those things that are hidden. That implies that the Rambam is telling us there are 2 areas that we're supposed to know in order to develop this knowledge of Hashem, and by extension in order to develop this relationship with Hashem. 2 areas. One is called the knowledge of our Creator, and the other one is called the things that are the secrets. In the beginning of his book, he talks about 2 things: Maaseh Merkava, the story of Hashem's chariot, and Maaseh Bereshis, the story of creation. Those must link up, right? So when we talk about the knowledge of our Creator, that sounds like we're talking about the story of the divine chariot. And when he says you're going to know the secret things, that sounds like it's talking about the story of the mechanism behind creation. So at this point in time, those 2 major topics are things that we can only learn superficially. When Mashiach comes, we'll be able to learn them fully. So what we now have to work out is what's the difference between secrets and the knowledge of our Creator, and what's going to happen when Mashiach comes, basically. And based on that, to understand what we're supposed to be doing now, because obviously this process of studying about Hashem and coming to know Hashem is clearly preparing us for the time of Mashiach. So what exactly are we supposed to be doing? And that's what we'll, please God, conclude in the last segment.